Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming this morning, on this beautiful morning here in Perugia. Oh, just a few more people coming in. One second. So my name is Jon Wilks, and I'm here with an editorial analytics company called Content Insights. And we were set up by editors, for editors, largely because we had a sneaking suspicion at the time that things that weren't quite as they should be in the sort of editorial analytics world. Personally, I come from a print to digital background. I started off with Time Out magazine, and I was an international editor for them, where I was traveling around the world for them and setting up various magazines and then online versions of their publication. Before I started, I went back to London and started content marketing department at Havas Media, one of London's first content marketing departments. So I've been around the words industry from various angles for some time. But today I'd like to talk a little bit more about editorial analytics, because I think there's a difficulty with editorial analytics at the moment. I generally feel that although we all have analytics in our newsroom, most editors don't really have a good idea of what they're doing with them. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how we got to that point and how we can take the next step onwards. So I started with a little experiment. I started with the phrase big data, which everybody knows, and it's been one of those buzz phrases for the last, well, I'd say decade or so. I did a little experiment here where I just Google searched the phrase big data. Straight away, I found that there were about 65.5 million search results for that phrase alone, for big data alone. 785,000 video search results for big data. And approximately about 250 hashtag big data tweets per day. So clearly, data and analytics are sort of, they're everywhere, they're everything. And big data has become the kind of phrase that has sort of broken free of its moorings, and it's become a word for the everyman, really. Experiment went on to use editorial analytics. That's not analytics alone, it's editorial analytics, quite a specific thing. Unsurprisingly, the results were a lot lower. We're looking at about 4,020 Google search results for editorial analytics. We're looking at about 8 video search results for editorial analytics. And we're looking at about 2 hashtag editorial analytics results per day on Twitter, mostly by me, I should admit. So I think even within our industry, people are still unaware that there's a difference between analytics in general and editorial analytics, analytics that we can use as editors. To most people, I think analytics is analytics is analytics. But it's this distinction, as I think in the editorial industry, is really dragging us back at the moment. So for an industry that likes to be first to the breaking news, I think we're surprisingly uncutting edge a lot of the time. So editorial analytics is a new thing, right? Well, actually, no. It sounds like quite a shiny new thing, but it's been around a lot longer than most people think. The problem is that like most industries, we're attracted to shiny, bleepy things that spit out vast numbers. And we're so busy sort of admiring vast page views and slapping each other on the back over scroll depth that there's a kind of emperor's new clothes situation that's built up, where I think pertinent questions are only recently being spoken out loud. I think a lot of editors don't like to appear to be wrong, so they like to appear to know what they're talking about. And with analytics, they just kind of accept what's put in front of them and don't really question what they're seeing. I think the pertinent questions that really need to be asked, obviously, are what do these statistics mean? How can I make better use of them to improve my publication? But perhaps the most important one is, are we even using the right metrics in the first place? So, as journalists, we like a good story, so I thought we'd go right back to the beginning and see how our story with analytics diverges a little and why we need to get back on track. I have a little question. Does anybody have any idea when the first editorial analytics appeared? Nobody at all. Okay, I'm not surprised. Well, there's a chap called Thomas Davenport and he's the head of the International Institute for Analytics. And he thinks that there are 3 eras of analytics that we're going through, and then we're currently in the 3rd one. The earliest analytics department that he's aware of came about in the 1950s, and that was with UPS in the States. But that's obviously a corporate analytics company, looking at analytics to define behavior, audience behavior, and that kind of thing. In fact, I think editorial analytics go a little further than that. I think editorial focus groups first appeared in around the 1920s, and a woman called Jenny Kitzinger of Cardiff University has done some research into that. This is very much anecdotal analytics. We're very much talking about focus groups, as I say. Of course, only slightly later, we had propaganda in wartime that was also, they used a lot of focus groups and a form of analytics to work out whether that was working or not. So we've been using these forms of statistical and analytical anecdotes for a very long time, I think. But if we take Davenport's point, he suggests it's the 1950s that it really kicked off properly. And he suggests that right back in the early days, analytics departments were not taken seriously. Companies wanted them, but they didn't really know what to do with them. And I hate to say it, that even though we're, 70 years on, I think that sounds awfully familiar to our own industry at the moment. Just to take a little snapshot of what Davenport noticed in the early days, he noticed that analytics were kept in back rooms and segregated from business people and decisions. He noticed that few organizations competed on analytics. Analytics were marginal to strategy. And he noticed that decisions were made based on experience and intuition. Again, it's worryingly reminiscent to me. Whenever I go into a newsroom, I see quite a lot of these kind of behaviors. Largely, as I say, because editors, if we're honest, don't want to speak up and say, I don't really understand what's going on here. They're just happy to let things roll on. It actually gets worse. So other things he pointed out, take your time. Nobody's interested in your results anyway. And if possible, spend much more time getting data ready for analysis than actually analyzing it. And that particular one, I notice a huge amount in newsrooms and in industries that use analytics in general. What worries me particularly about that is that these are literally 1950s attitudes towards analytics. And in the editorial industry, it's still very much prevalent today. I think in our industry at the moment, having analytics feels a little like something we ought to do because other people are doing it. It's a kind of keeping up with the Joneses. Everyone else has analytics, so we ought to have them as well. So Davenport's second era of analytics starts in the 1990s when the internet becomes ubiquitous. And surely enough, because people are doing things on the internet, somebody decides that they need to work out how analytics can play a part in that. Does anybody recognize this? Does anybody? Yes. You do? What is it?
It's an early analytics tool, like bought by Google, I think.
That's right. Yeah, so in its early days, it was called Urchin. It started in about 1997, and it was the first commercially available analytics package. Obviously, as you've just said, it became, in 2005, Google Analytics. Google Analytics today, as of about 2015, Google Analytics was being used by about half of the world's websites. It had an 83.4% share of the analytics market. And recently, actually, a report suggested that 81% of people in our industry are using analytics now. And you can be pretty sure that most of those packages were based partly on Google Analytics, or indeed maybe Google Analytics themselves. So Google Analytics, nothing particularly wrong with Google Analytics. It has its champions and its retractors. And largely, it's a very good analytics package if you're a marketer. But I think that's the point that's worth underlining here. Google Analytics was developed by marketers for marketers. Its successful use requires predicting a funnel, following a funnel, recording activity, and Google Analytics obviously does that very well. But it has this plethora of sort of shiny bells and whistles that I think have become particularly damaging to the modern editor. I think we've been led down a sort of garden path of what we call single metrics, which are page views, dwell time, things that we've kind of lapped up without really understanding. Now, I'll come back to this, but I think it's been incredibly damaging to the editorial industry, and specifically how we fund it. To go back to the timeline of what happened with analytics, in this second era, Davenport points out that as we moved forward, we arrived in the era of social media, which of course are platforms that are based on real-time analytics, machines that can act on data at the moment it was harvested, so took the human being out of that equation. It also was data that had a direct effect on how you felt. This was the first time that data could record our popularity, really, in a real-time sense. I don't know if anybody remembers Clout. I don't even know if Clout is still going. Some people do. Do you know? Is it still active? No idea. Okay. So Clout was a website that claimed to be able to calculate your popularity based on social analytics. And there were sort of ridiculous periods where places like San Francisco Airport were allowing you access to VIP lounges if you had a particularly high Clout score, which, you know, crazy world that we live in. But the point is really that this was data that really was affecting how you felt. You know, it's amazingly, if teachers had told me back in the day that, that data and this kind of thing could affect my dopamine levels, then I would have paid far more attention in maths class, I think. Moving forward again, by 2010, we have that first mention of big data. And while a lot of sort of data-reliant industries start racing ahead at this point, this is where the editorial industry starts to become quite unstuck. I think we have a situation here as well where the algorithm enters the popular vernacular. More and more people are starting to understand, or think they understand, what's going on here. And perhaps the biggest shock of all is that data geeks are sort of allowed out of their hutches. They get called data scientists and they all get given pay rises, which is again something I don't think any maths teacher would have ever predicted. But in the newsroom, not so much happening. We're still hung up on these things that I'm calling single metrics. And I should briefly cover off what a single metric means here. When we think about things like page views and dwell time and these kind of things, it's a metric that's taken in singularity. That's why we're calling it single metrics. In singularity, it tells you nothing about behavior. And we'll come back to this in a moment. But unfortunately, it's what a huge amount of our industry is based on. We start using the ubiquitous like and share in our industry. Apparently, it indicates something. Nobody's quite sure what it is, but we'll use it anyway because the numbers are really high. It looks great. Twitter starts talking about page impressions, and sort of 1,000 ad agencies across the world start pulling the wool over their clients' eyes because page impressions are huge, always look huge, but don't mean anything beyond somebody scanning through and not really paying any guaranteed attention to anything. And finally, last year in 2016, somebody stood up, I believe it was Mashable, stood up and did a report that suggested what many of us had been suspecting for some time, which was that 59% of people who share articles on Facebook have never read them in the first place. So we're not talking about engagement anymore at all. We've got this kind of dichotomy between data-powered industries and the editorial industry, whereby you have, in a data-powered world, you've got this rapid and integral use of data at the highest levels, powering decision-making within the organizations. And over here, you've got editors struggling to find time to do their jobs, find time to look at analytics, or even understand what they're looking at in the first place. In the data-powered industry, you've got multiple data types combined, coming together to create user behavior and to sort of really personalize what things are doing. And we're getting there, don't get me wrong, we get there a little bit. But largely, we're still enslaved to tools that were developed for marketing that emphasize single metrics and sort of increase an over-reliance on vanity metrics and real-time data. Kind of get stuck there. As I say, some people are starting to use the data in a more intelligent way, but really editors taking their reports on a daily basis aren't getting anything that really tells them about engagement whatsoever. So I feel like we should just go down into that a little bit more. Why are we so down on these page views? And what are these single metrics that we're really blabbering on about? I think largely people are starting to understand that page views are a bad thing, or at least they've heard in the industry that page views are not a reliable thing to look at. But I don't think a lot of people could actually tell you why that is. Maybe quite a few of you could, but it's worth going over it just in case. A page view in most metrics packages symbolizes little more than a browser firing. So it's nothing more than that. It's the record of a technical occurrence. It doesn't tell you anything at all about whether anybody stayed around to read your article or any form of engagement whatsoever. Similarly, time spent on page, which is where a lot of editors went after they realized that page views weren't of use, time spent on page has a similar problem. We're looking at a browser staying open for X amount of time. Again, it doesn't tell you anything about whether that person's wandered off to have a cup of tea or anything like that. It doesn't tell you about behavior. It's just telling you, in technical terms, that a browser stayed open. An example I always like to give is that my wife has, whenever I open my wife's laptop, it has 25 tabs open, some of which have been open for 2 months at a time. And if you were looking at an analytics package and thinking that was great engagement, then you've got to have a screw loose slightly. Similarly, the next point following page view and time spent on page was scroll depth. I hear this a huge amount from editors at the moment. Scroll depth is the metric that you're supposed to be looking at, by which it means how far down the page your reader has traveled. Again, this is a single metric. Taken on its own, it doesn't tell you very much at all. If you think about how you look at most articles on a morning when you haven't got much time, you tend to do this with your phone. You scroll at high speed. You might get to 75% of the article, and your metrics package, your data package, shows you such and such a person got 75% of the way through an article. But they didn't do it with anything that you could call engagement. They flicked through it at high speed. So again, you're dealing with a situation where you're receiving and basing your strategies on metrics that don't tell you anything whatsoever. I think this is nuts, to tell you the truth. I think it's really crazy. I think many people in the editorial industry are starting to realize that this is the case, but they're not doing terribly much about it. And I think it's really insane that we're trying to build this digital industry on metrics that we don't understand, and that we're trying to monetize this industry on metrics that we don't understand. It's a mad situation to be in. The latest thing, of course, is real-time metrics. Most newsrooms have real-time metrics boards in place now. So this is something that we really ought to be questioning, I think, and not enough people are. I think real-time metrics are great if you're a front-page editor and you're looking to sort of maximize clicks in the moment. But for strategizing content and long-term planning, again, not a very useful tool. And I would suggest that real-time analytics of this nature really encourages editors to chase page views. Again, we've seen that that's not a great thing to be doing. I'll give a quick example of how this might happen. So an editor looks at the trending news. Quite often editors, it's worth pointing out, editors make use of third-party platforms which will tell them what the trending news is. But those trending tools, quite often there's only about 3 or 4 of them in use. So you have a situation where all these newsrooms are effectively using the same trending tools. So straight away, you're sort of homogenizing what everybody's looking at, what everybody's news is. So the editor looks at the trending news. And they go off and they commission from their staff maybe 4 or 5 articles, 5 or 6 articles that cover off the bases on that particular trending news story. So that story races up to the top of the real-time analytics screens. So the editor orders more of the same. And the story starts to drop in popularity, but the editor sort of milks it for all it's worth. And again, this is where the front page editor can make use of real-time analytics, because he can see what's working in the moment. But again, it's not a long-term situation. Trouble is that they kind of rinse and repeat that. So off they go and they start it again. And you've got this situation where you really are just chasing page views. I would go so far as to say it's not the cause of, but it certainly feeds the echo chamber that we heard so much about last year. It encourages editors and journalists to give readers what readers think they want. And the days of sort of editorial newspapers informing readers and shaping conversations starts to slip away then. It sort of feeds the temptation as well to ditch what originally made the publication individual, homogenizing the news. Readers find it harder and harder to differentiate between news brands, and publications without anything specific to say really start to struggle at this point. We're in that time of the world where we need one of these, so here's the obligatory Trump example. My colleague at Content Insights, a chap called Dejan Nikolic, gives the analogy of a fishing magazine editor. The fishing magazine editor gets a surprise one morning when he posts an article about Donald Trump's fondness for tuna melt sandwiches. And that's fake news, by the way. When he sees his real-time stats go through the roof, he scrambles his teams to produce more Donald Trump articles. Again, it's not a sustainable strategy because his readers aren't there for Donald Trump articles, his readers are there for the fishing. But unfortunately, the tendency to scramble in that way is quite strong in a lot of editors, especially editors that have got bottom lines to hit that's quite often based on metrics, single metrics that we've talked about already. And so the editorial strategies go out of the window and the readership trust starts to weaken. So single metrics, my view and our view, is they should be replaced with something that we're calling scored metrics. So to really understand reader engagement through metrics, these scored metrics are required, I think. Scored metrics are really a way of analysing and comparing the single metrics that we've spoken about already to see how they interact to tell a story of reader behaviour. So why do we call them scored metrics? Well, very simply, if single metrics are metrics taken in singularity, then scored metrics are metrics that take those single metrics and look at the relationships between them. It's not simply adding those metrics together. It's looking at the relationships between them, and done well, I think you can really see how engaged a reader is at every point in the article, and you can adjust it accordingly. So in the industry, there's starting to be calls for something called an article score. Kritsanarat Kunkum, he works with Die Welt, has talked last year at the WANIFRA conference. He talked quite a lot about the need for an industry-wide article score. And in fact, at Die Welt, they've started developing an article score that takes 6 single metrics and adds them together to come with a score that goes, that sort of scores how well that article has done. Again, that's not really a very effective way because it's taking a single snapshot of the performance of an article at any given moment. But it's the right start, I think. It's moving away from single metrics and starting to think more about how those things work together to show proper engagement. In our neighbouring industry, and the industry that feeds us, possibly the most, Mark Pritchard of Procter & Gamble has called for the ad world to grow up and start using industry standard verification metrics. That was music to our ears at Content Insights because we've been working on something of this nature for about half a decade, working on the idea of an article score that we call CPI, which is Content Performance Indicator. And that goes beyond those 6 metrics that Die Welt are using. We use about 30 single metrics and look at about 100 different ways in which they could relate to each other to show genuine reader engagement. So when you're looking at, for example, in this screen here, when you're looking at this chart at the bottom, which we're calling read depth, that's not just a scroll depth showing how far someone scrolled, that's genuinely showing how far through the article somebody has actually, or the majority of your audience has actually managed to get before they drop out. And using that as a chart, you can then go into your article and look at how you could make changes at that point in the article. Very quickly, my last slide is just to do with what I think the future of analytics ought to be. I think we really need to recalibrate our approach to data. We need to develop tools of our own, not borrowing other people's tools from other industries. I think we need to really fully subscribe to the idea that single metrics alone aren't going to tell us enough, and we need to look instead to scored metrics that understand how the strands of data that we gather relate to one another. I think editors need to admit more readily that having access to data is simply not enough. We need to get better at asking questions of the data we collect. We need to get better at understanding what that data means and how we can implement it to improve performance. Otherwise, the time that we have to spare is time wasted. And finally, I think we have to stop chasing that dopamine buzz. We need to build trust by defining and strengthening our editorial strategies rather than chasing what we think the audience wants, or rather what we think the audience wants. So scored editorial metrics, I think, will help to get us there and help us to avoid that, the dreaded echo chamber that we heard so much about last year. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I didn't get how you got the scored metrics for the article. What kind of tool gives you that?
So the tool that we've developed is a tool that can plug into any website and into any CMS. And it looks at the analytics, as I said, it's looking at about 30 different single metrics and scoring them. So rather than just looking at them in isolation, we're looking at how they relate to each other. So, for example, if you've got 10,000 page views, how many of those are actually creating a certain amount of scroll depth time, rather than just looking at page views and saying, surely that's an example of a great performance. We look at a load of different things in order to work out really whether there was engagement taking place or not.
Just to mention another tool like this, for example, Chartbeat.
So Chartbeat are also very much in what we would call the attention movement situation, where we think that attention is really the forward way to think. As I understand Chartbeat, a lot of what Chartbeat concentrates is real time. So they're specialists in real time. And again, there's nothing wrong with real time per se, but I think if you're looking for an editorial strategy and a way to strategize your editorial, then real time is exactly that. It tells you what's happening now. It doesn't tell you why that's happening. It doesn't suggest to you what might happen tomorrow. So that's the difference. Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if you have any insights on how your metrics correlate or relate to business results, because the situation right now in publishing companies is that careers are built, careers are made on meeting the metrics that you obviously despise and which we do as well. But people get to positions like editor-in-chiefs because basically what they do is they ruin traditional journalistic brands by just chasing those vanity metrics. But the executive level in the publishing houses, they have been told that this is the way to go. This is what pushes revenue, what pushes ad revenue. So you are pursuing what I perceive more as a quality-driven approach. But how do you sell this to companies who say, well, yeah, but what we really need is reach, frequency, and ad input?
Sure. No, it is a really good question. And I think it goes back to what we mentioned in that last question to do with what's known as the attention movement, which has been going for, I'd say, about 5 years, and it's slowly building up steam. It's about educating people and advertisers, really. I mean, advertisers love those huge numbers. They love those page impressions. But quite often they don't really understand what they're talking about either. And when you actually sit down with an advertiser who's commissioning for those things, and you ask them to explain to you what they think they're getting out of it, and then you show them what they're actually getting out of it. Take, for example, sorry, I'll skip back a couple of slides. Take, for example, that screen there. If you have an article where 20% of the people didn't even start reading, you know, and you're basing your advertiser is expecting some kind of, you know, that they're expecting to be able to see their adverts, or that people are seeing their adverts, and you can show them quite clearly that actually nobody got as far as your advert whatsoever. Then it becomes a question almost a question of sanity, I think. It's like, why would you be paying for that? Surely the way forward is to be paying for something where people spend time with that advert or around that advert. The data changes all the time in terms of how long it takes for an advert to be seen, for it to go into the memory in some way. Every day you can look at a different article that says it's 36 seconds, or it's 10 seconds, or it's 3 seconds, or whatever it may be. It's certainly not 0 seconds. So you need to get people into an article. If you're going to monetize that article with advertising, you need to get people spending time on that page. I think it's about educating the ad industry as a whole, which is a huge job, admittedly, that's the way that it needs to go. But there are positive signs. People like the Financial Times in London are now, part of their advertising package has to do with attention. So they like to charge, rather than by, per 1,000 page views, they're now charging by time spent on page as well. Again, that time spent on page is a single metric, so I still think we've got a little way to go there, but it's certainly the right direction to be going.
Can I just add, I'm also from Content Insights. Can I just give a more concrete answer? The tool does have something that we call behavioral pages, which correspond to 3 business models that publishers use. So that is reach, basically, if you're chasing exposure, then engagement and loyalty. So the tool actually tells you how your content performs in context of these 3, whatever your business model is. So it will very directly tell you, hey, this piece of content contributed most to engagement, loyalty, or exposure.
Thank you, Mario.
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting points. One thing I'm a bit confused about is whether you would see the risk that the same logic, let's say, of editorial selection that you criticized a little bit at the top level moves now into the article, because maybe editors can, in the long term, see better which kind of passages in the article really attracted the attention. Because I read a little bit between the lines of your presentation and got the feeling that you were arguing a little bit more for better content. And I'm wondering whether it's really changing the principle when you give people better metrics, or whether it just moves like from the level of I choose between topics and kick out those things that are not like mass compatible to moving into the article, and maybe kicking out all those types of segments that are also not so mass popular.
So first of all, with the tool that we're talking about here, we talked a bit before about CPI, this content performance indicator. That's judging content against content like for like. So it's not saying, it would be ridiculous to be saying, sports journalism should be compared with political journalism, because you're obviously going to get completely different engagement things. So when it's looking at those individual sections and topics, then it's looking very specifically at articles within those sections and how well they performed against each other. But I think the other point is that we're not trying to cherry pick or sort of put a glossy view on any of the analytics that we present. We just present, what we're interested in presenting is analytics that, whether they've been good or bad. So when you go into looking into those articles and you have a look at the paragraphs, as you're saying, that might have worked well or anything like that, you can really look across the board at the various different articles that you've done and see if there's a consistency there. I don't think we're particularly advocating, well, we are advocating for better quality content, that's certainly true. But I think metrics that in the single metrics area, you're really avoiding that quality idea entirely. The quality that's being judged there is the quality of your headline quite often, or even more importantly, quite how controversial your headline is, what kind of emotional reaction it gets from your audience, rather than anything else. Okay.
I'm just be interested in the question, if you're already working with publishers, do you have some insights how the newsrooms change their behavior after using Content Insights?
So I don't have that information here on this computer, but sure, if you come and chat to us afterwards, we'd be happy to talk to you about that.
Okay. Later then.
Okay. Thanks very much for your time. Oh. One more?
If I could, one more question, if I may, because I was just curious, how do you differentiate, if you could go into that just in brief, you mentioned that just dwell time on an article or scroll depth does not really tell you anything about if the reader actually read the article, interacted with it in any way. How can you tell if he does that? Do you have any additional metrics, or what's the way of discovering that?
As we said before, we're looking at those 30 different metrics. Again, it's worth chatting to us afterwards if you want to know a bit more about that. But it's looking at how those things work. So, for example, if you've got a page that has an article with 800 words and you've got an average read time and you've got a specific scroll depth, then you're able to see far more clearly by looking at the relationship between those metrics whether somebody's actually done anything with it. Scroll depth and page time taken alone would only show you that somebody had got to a certain depth and then stayed there. But once you take into account a whole variety of those different things, such as word count, and average time spent on page, and how they relate to each other, then you start to get a far more accurate picture.
How do you judge the long form?
Well, it's the same thing. It's that it's taking those things, scroll depth, word count, all of those different metrics to see how engaged somebody has. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at an article that's 300 words or you're looking at an article that's 10,000 words. It's judging it based on that article and articles that are similar to it in order to see whether it's actually had an engaged effect.
Like content versus like content. We don't compare articles with 300 words with articles with 10,000 words because that's ridiculous. We don't compare galleries, which will get versus serious political commentary. And single mentions do that. They give you this one narrow field where you only look at one single thing. And then you create your entire strategy based on that one single thing, or single things.
The reading time is done very low, so if you find an article in which the reading time is quite high, that's an excellent. Doesn't matter if it's a long form or not.
So we're getting cut-off signs now, so thanks very much for your time. Come and chat to us if you want to talk a bit more. That would be great. Thank you. Analytics to work out whether that was working or not. So we've been using these forms of statistical and analytical anecdotes for a very long time, I think. But if we take Davenport's point, he suggests it's the 1950s that it really kicked off properly. And he suggests that right back in the early days, analytics departments were not taken seriously. Companies wanted them, but they didn't really know what to do with them. And I hate to say it, that even though we're, 70 years on, I think that sounds awfully familiar to our own industry at the moment. Just to take a little snapshot of what Davenport noticed in the early days, he noticed that analytics were kept in back rooms and segregated from business people and decisions. He noticed that few organizations competed on analytics. Analytics were marginal to strategy. And he noticed that decisions were made based on experience and intuition. Again, it's worryingly reminiscent to me. Whenever I go into a newsroom, I see quite a lot of these kind of behaviors. Largely, as I say, because editors, if we're honest, don't want to speak up and say, I don't really understand what's going on here. They're just happy to let things roll on. It actually gets worse. So other things he pointed out, take your time. Nobody's interested in your results anyway. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming this morning on this beautiful morning here in Perugia. Oh, just a few more people coming in. One second. So my name is Jon Wilks, and I'm here with an editorial analytics company called Content Insights. And we were set up by editors, for editors, largely because we had a sneaking suspicion at the time that things that weren't quite as they should be in the sort of editorial analytics world. Personally, I come from a print to digital background. I started off with Time Out magazine, and I was an international editor for them, where I was traveling around the world for them and setting up various magazines and then online versions of their publication. Before I started, I went back to London and started content marketing department at Havas Media, one of London's first content marketing departments. So I've been around the words industry from various angles for some time. But today I'd like to talk a little bit more about editorial analytics, because I think there's a difficulty with editorial analytics at the moment. I generally feel that although we all have analytics in our newsroom, most editors don't really have a good idea of what they're doing with them. And I'd like to talk a little bit about how we got to that point and how we can take the next step onwards. So I started with a little experiment. I started with the phrase big data, which everybody knows, and it's been one of those buzz phrases for the last, well, I'd say, decade or so. I did a little experiment here where I just Google searched the phrase big data. Straight away, I found that there were about 65.5 million search results for that phrase alone, for big data alone. 785,000 video search results for big data. And approximately about 250 hashtag big data tweets per day. So clearly, data and analytics are sort of, they're everywhere, they're everything. And big data has become the kind of phrase that has sort of broken free of its moorings, and it's become a word for the everyman, really. Experiment went on to use editorial analytics. That's not analytics alone, it's editorial analytics, quite a specific thing. Unsurprisingly, the results were a lot lower. We're looking at about 4,020 Google search results for editorial analytics. We're looking at about 8 video search results for editorial analytics. And we're looking at about 2 hashtag editorial analytics results per day on Twitter, mostly by me, I should admit. So I think even within our industry, people are still unaware that there's a difference between analytics in general and editorial analytics, analytics that we can use as editors. To most people, I think analytics is analytics is analytics. But it's this distinction, as I think in the editorial industry, is really dragging us back at the moment. So for an industry that likes to be first to the breaking news, I think we're surprisingly uncutting edge a lot of the time. So editorial analytics is a new thing, right? Well, actually, no. It sounds like quite a shiny new thing, but it's been around a lot longer than most people think. The problem is that like most industries, we're attracted to shiny, bleepy things that spit out vast numbers. And we're so busy sort of admiring vast page views and slapping each other on the back over scroll depth that there's a kind of emperor's new clothes situation that's built up, where I think pertinent questions are only recently being spoken out loud. I think a lot of editors don't like to appear to be wrong, so they like to appear to know what they're talking about. And with analytics, they just kind of accept what's put in front of them and don't really question what they're seeing. I think the pertinent questions that really need to be asked, obviously, are what do these statistics mean? How can I make better use of them to improve my publication? But perhaps the most important one is, are we even using the right metrics in the first place? So, as journalists, we like a good story, so I thought we'd go right back to the beginning and see how our story with analytics diverges a little and why we need to get back on track. I have a little question. Does anybody have any idea when the first editorial analytics appeared? Nobody at all. Okay, I'm not surprised. Well, there's a chap called Thomas Davenport, and he's the head of the International Institute for Analytics. And he thinks that there are 3 eras of analytics that we're going through, and then we're currently in the 3rd one. The earliest analytics department that he's aware of came about in the 1950s, and that was with UPS in the States. But that's obviously a corporate analytics company, looking at analytics to define behavior, audience behavior, and that kind of thing. In fact, I think editorial analytics go a little further than that. I think editorial focus groups first appeared in around the 1920s, and a woman called Jenny Kitzinger of Cardiff University has done some research into that. This is very much anecdotal analytics. We're very much talking about focus groups, as I say. Of course, only slightly later, we had propaganda in wartime that was also, they used a lot of focus groups, and a form of